Well, we've been talking a lot about these Zoom calls for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz that have drawn thousands and thousands of people. In fact, on September 19th, Win with Black Women, the organizer, Takeda Edie, who was on our show last week, she is teaming up with Oprah Winfrey and 140 grassroots organizations. They are going to have what they believe to be the largest Zoom call ever for Harris and Walz. Takeda told us on the show last week that Zoom was changing this platform so that up to 1 million people can join in on a Zoom call. So if you haven't already gotten that invitation, start checking their website, asking your friends, because you want to be one of those. I'm sure they're going to break the record of 1 million people on Zoom with Oprah Winfrey, Takeda Edie, and a host of 140 other grassroots organizations. So we had Takeda on. We had Michael Blake. He was one of the organizers of Black Men for Kamala Harris. We had one of the organizers for White Women for Kamala Harris. So it only seems fitting to me that we have the organizer of the call for South Asian folks for Kamala Harris. That is one of the organizers who has been working not just on the Zoom call, but also on the ground, trying to organize Asian American voters. And we know that Indian Americans are now the largest population among Asian Americans. This is according to a recent U.S. Census survey. And we also know that Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and Michigan, all key swing states, have relatively large Indian American communities that could prove pivotal to a tight race for the Oval Office. In fact, the Georgia legislature has 7 lawmakers of Asian American descent, and they are from both Republican and Democratic parties. 5 Indian Americans serve in our U.S. Congress. Usha Vance, that happens to be the wife of Ohio Senator and GOP Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance, is an Indian American, as were 2 of the most prominent candidates in the 2024 Republican primary, Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy. We know that Democratic Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington State chairs the Congressional Progressive Caucus. She was one of the first lawmakers that VP Harris called for support after Joe Biden bowed out of the race on July 21st. So when you look at Indian Americans, you look at the ones that are serving in Congress, you look at ones that are both Democratic and Republican, the question that I'm thinking of, where are most Indian Americans breaking in terms of their politics? Are they leaning more right? Are they leaning more left? And what are the issues that are motivating them to become so involved in electoral politics? Also, what role are they likely to play in this year's election, particularly in those key swing states? We know that many minority groups are hard to mobilize, hard to organize, hard to get them to see the value in electoral politics. Is that true of Indian Americans? Going to be asking 2 activists, organizers, and key community leaders who have been organizing Indian American voters for decades now. Tanbir Chowdhury is here. He's a campaign strategist. He's the president of a group called They See Blue New York. He's also the director of public affairs and communications for a New York Assemblywoman. So he knows a lot about what it takes to organize voters, not just Indian voters, but all voters, to win elections. Also, Anurima Bhargava is going to join us a little later in the show. She is that woman that was responsible for organizing that Zoom for South Asians for Kamala Harris. Going to talk to Anurima. She and I were actually both delegates from the state of California at the DNC convention just a couple of weeks ago. We sat next to each other on a couple of nights. So we've been in conversations about what it's going to take to win this election. So excited to welcome Anurima back to the show and to welcome Tanbir to get his take on the state of Indian and Asian voters in particular, leading into what's now about 60 days, less than 60 days before the November election. Tanbir, what are some of the things you are hearing and seeing on the ground as it relates to Indian and then more broadly Asian voters as it relates to this election?
Yes, good evening. So thank you for having me, Areva. It's an honor. So I want to start by saying Vice President Harris, at the top of the ticket, she's a historic candidate. She's the first Black woman nominee and the first South Asian nominee as well. So what that aspect we have here, a lot of people, we see a lot of ourselves in her. A lot of Indian Americans are happy. I know in New York in particular, one of the battles we had, again, as you mentioned, I work in the state assembly. The member I work for is Assemblywoman Jenifer Rajkumar, who is also the first South Asian woman elected in state office in New York. And one of the first battles we did was making Diwali a school holiday in New York City. And that was a historic movement. Kamala Harris will be the first president who grew up celebrating Diwali. So that means a lot going forward. We see a lot of ourselves. There's a cultural symbolism, there's a significance there. But, back to the issues, because there are issues, there's policies, there's impact there that you still have to have the conversations about. The concerns a lot of them are having are affordability. Where are we going to go with our economy? There's affordability. People are worried about. A lot of parents are worried about if their children are going to be able to grow up and afford to move back into the neighborhoods they grew up in. On Long Island, that's the biggest concern. Kids move out to go to college. They can't afford to move back into Nassau County, into Suffolk County. They're worried about the border. That's been kind of like the biggest issue in all of these House races we're fighting. That bipartisan border bill that House Republicans, not for nothing, that House Republicans killed at the order of Donald Trump because he wanted to score political points rather than solve an issue that was affecting people. They killed this bill, and it's concerning a lot of people and it ties back into the economy as well. It ties back into public safety. So I think those are the two biggest issues, and they're very broad issues too. So we could spend a lot of time getting into the more micro topics about economy and public safety, but those are like the two very big issues that are on South Asian voters' minds, at least from the conversations I've been having, that the members and volunteers of my organization have been having when we call voters, when we write to them, when we knock on their doors.
So I think for a lot of people, when they think of women in politics that are Indian, they probably think of Representative Jaya Paul, who's a progressive Democrat and from the state of Washington. And they may think of Nikki Haley because both of these are high profile Indian women who've been in the news a great deal. They seem very, Nikki Haley, I don't know if she was, from a wealthy family, but obviously she's wealthy. Jaya Paul appears not to be, from what I've heard her talk about her family upbringing. There's the issue of assimilation. I think a lot of people are confused about, do Nikki Haley seem to go in and out of whether she was a woman of color. Some people thought she was white and they thought she assimilated, tried to erase her Indian history. Help us understand what that experience is like, because I think there are a lot of non-Indian Americans who, like I said, if these two women are their examples of high-profile Indian women, one is there's different as night and day.
Yeah, so one thing I always say is that the AAPI electorate as a whole, and then the South Asian electorate is not monolithic. And as you said, Congresswoman Jayapal, Nikki Haley, Nimrata Haley was her name. She changed it to Nikki, like you said. Some of them try to hide or try to conceal their cultural origins to appeal to their party, the people in their party, for reasons you're free to interpret. But what I say to that is that at the end, that's really what it is, because there's also Tulsi Gabbard. She was a Democratic congresswoman. She is South Asian. She endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016. She endorsed Joe Biden in 2020. And now she's behind Donald Trump. She's on his transition team. But even then, like there's some people who, with Tulsi Gabbard particularly, there's people who are like, they've always seen that. They've warned people about her. And there are other people who are like, they couldn't see it coming if it was a truck coming 80, you know. Um, But if you look at her voting record, and even if you hear some of her like interviews and stuff talking about her personal background, she talks about how her father, who also was a politician, very conservative. She grew up in a Hindu conservative household. So there's also that cultural barrier that a lot of South Asian households are like kind of in the mold of.
So if you think, Tanbir, like, I know you're not a monolithic community. There aren't any, right? Blacks aren't monolithic. Yeah. Latinos aren't monolithic. But, overwhelmingly Black voters are Democratic. You get some Republican voters who are registered and who show up for Republican candidates, but you can count on the overwhelming number of Black voters being Democrats. When you think about Indian voters, are they overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democrats? Or, is it 50-50, 40-60? Where are the voters?
I would say that they're really unaffiliated. A lot of them, for the most part, are unaffiliated. A lot of them don't really play partisan politics. But if you had to give them a label, I would say they tend to lean conservative. They tend to lean conservative. Messaging is where it really comes down to, because you have these conversations with them. A lot of the politics, a lot of what they want, it's democratic principles. Education is a core value.
So where's the leaning Republican? Where does that stem from?
It comes from like affordability. It comes from taxes. A lot of them, like working families, homeowners, they have these concerns about taxes, homeowner taxes. They have their public safety. And then again, like the immigration crisis we're facing, the border crisis we're facing, like the GOP right now, a lot of the policies that they run on, they know that the broader populace would not agree with them on any given day. But the messaging they're doing around the border crisis, that's where they're winning ground on amongst all the minority demographics that Democrats otherwise win every other election. That's why they didn't want to pass this bipartisan border bill, because
but what is it about the immigration issue that resonates with Indian voters? I mean, are they buying into this notion that too many immigrants are coming into the country? They're taking their jobs. Like what part of that Republican talking point around immigration really moves them?
Yeah, I think what part of it that moves them the most is the public safety aspect. The fear mongering is what really is winning them over, because there's some bad instances, but the GOP takes these few instances and they really just make a mountain out of a molehill, and they put it on the airwaves. They put it in these mailers that they really just send into our mailboxes. They put it on our Facebook, our YouTube, our Hulu ads, back to back. During the Tom Swazi special election, I was getting them 2-3 times in a row, nonstop, relentlessly. And it gets into people's minds. At the end of the day, a lot of people don't fact check. They don't do that due diligence to fact check. They get something, they see it on their screen. And if they see it enough times, that's what they're going to go with. They're going to believe it. If not at the first time, the second time or third time, they're eventually going to start believing it. And I think that's the issue that we're having with the South Asian voters, because a lot of them, they genuinely do believe that they're not safe with like migrants around the corner, or migrants, even if there's like a migrant shelter, not in the immediate vicinity around them. They think that just them being anywhere around their children are not safe, or they're not safe.
And they think that migrants are inherently dangerous because they've listened to the GOP rhetoric about migrants as drug dealers and, cartel leaders and rapists, and that message has resonated with them.
Yeah, I'm going based off of my experience with, I live in New York's 3rd Congressional District. We had George Santos as our congressman, and we had that special election. And I live 2 blocks from a migrant shelter, Creedmoor. So that was a huge talking point for the Republican Party, for Mazi Philip, who was our Republican opponent. And she ran with that. And it was like, while I was meeting, again, my team focused on South Asian voters. And a lot of them, that was what they pointed to. They were like, Democrats brought this over. Mayor Adams brought this over. We don't want Tom Swazi to do that. So we're concerned. They were reserved on Tom Swazi because they thought he was going to enable more migrant shelters, and they felt threatened. They felt that they were not safe in their own homes because this was now a part of their neighborhood. So it was winning them over. And even if it wasn't winning them over completely, it was still getting in their minds. Right. And you could tell when you're talking to them.
Anurima has joined us now. Thank you for joining us, Anurima. You heard Tanbir say that a lot of Asian Americans have bought into this, migrants are evil, violent people rhetoric from the right. How are you and other activists of South Asian who are activating South Asian voters? How are you combating those messages?
Well, it's thanks for having me, Areva, and Tanbir. Thanks for sharing the ways in which the fear mongering has taken place, and certainly in your community, and I think communities around the country. What's fascinating about it is that South Asians are, at this point in time, the third largest immigrant population still coming into the United States, right? And so a lot of the migrant populations that we're talking about have significant numbers of South Asians, and so it's a fascinating piece, right? Because I don't think a lot of people realize that. I don't think a lot of people in the South Asian community realize that. And so there's a particular image that's obviously being put out, as Tanbir was talking about, of who migrants are and the dangerous sort of stereotype of that. But that's not only something that doesn't accord with what we know about migrant populations generally, and it also doesn't accord with the fact that this is a significant part of, the migrant population is South Asian, and so many of our the vast majority of South Asians in this country have come post the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, and many who are in communities around the country that are close to some of the fear mongering came after 1980. So it's not, we have a long history in this country. South Asians do, in terms of our being part of the political landscape, but it's not one of those things where we are not part of the very fear mongering not that long ago that we're hearing right now. So I think the message is the message of the one that we've been sharing is one about this is us, right? This is us, and this is people who are coming here to try and build different lives, and they're people who are your cousins and your family and all the rest. So that's what we've been trying to put out.
Yeah, when you look at someone like J.D. Vance's wife, very successful, I would imagine well-respected attorney who is on the campaign trail defending J.D. Vance and some of the outlandish statements he has made about women, about families, now about neighbors, Haitian neighbors eating their neighbors' pets. When I think of, again, J.D. Vance's wife, high profile, Yale attorney, successful, working in a big corporate law firm, people see her, Anurima, they see Nikki Haley, and they have this impression that Indian women are pretty conservative, perhaps, assimilate, marry white men. Talk to us about Indian women.
Sure. So I'd say a few things about South Asian women. And so just to be clear, we did the South Asian Women for Harris Call, and that was the one that we raised the money on. And I'll say this, I'm also an Ivy League educated attorney, and I will tell you that Usha Vance is not who we are. We're not people who, what we see amongst South Asian women is a lot of women who are leading civil rights organizations. They're leading efforts to try and serve the community. They are not trying to propagate hate and that kind of engagement. And so I think in some ways what we see is something quite different than what Usha Vance has been allowing to be out there. And so I think in a lot of ways, the values that our families have grown up with of hard work, of helping your neighbors, of being part of a community. And I think the issues around women's rights that are being raised by J.D. Vance have really, I would say, energized South Asian women, because we, like every other woman in this country, are people who don't want to be limited in the ways in which we can live, the choices that we can make, and how we can actually support our families and our community. And there's a certain image that's being put out here about who women are and how they can actually show up. And I'm here to say that that's not at all what the real range of South Asian women, from our young people to our 80-year-olds. And we've got 80-year-old, 85-year-old aunties who are out here organizing because they have worked really hard to put out a very different image of who we are in this country, and to be part of strengthening the American fabric, and are disgusted by the ways in which J.D. Vance and certainly Usha Vance has been supporting the kind of rhetoric that's coming from him.
So this 12,000 women, South Asian women, that you were able to assemble for this Zoom call in the tradition of Jacada Edie and the Win with Black Women. Tell us about that. How did you get 12,000 women on a call? What were the topics that you discussed, and what motivated them to donate 350,000 and then to sign up to volunteer in the hundreds?
So I think that, so like Win with Black Women, I mean, so Jateka and Holly and many others, they've been organizing for many years and meeting weekly. And South Asians for Harris, which has also been part of, and They See Blue and others, like, so South Asians for Harris was South Asians for America. These are organizations that have been in place supporting people who are running for office, getting people registered, being on the ground for years. What happened with us was that the morning after the Win with Black Women call on Sunday, when President Biden had decided to drop out of the race, we were like, wait, we should do this for South Asian women too. So this is not an organization. South Asian for Women for Harris is just a couple of us who joined together, and that call happened in 2 days, right? And so what we had was women who are peace builders and bridge builders. We had women who are local electeds around the country, from Georgia, from Pennsylvania, from California. We had some of the leading policy advisors, including to Vice President Harris, people who have literally had leading positions in the Biden administration, who've had leading positions running reproductive rights organizations. And so we had policy folks, we had government folks, and we also had a bunch of youth organizers. We had the folks from all of the different South Asian organizations that have been really on the ground doing political work for quite some time. And the idea was to get people energized. And so that was that first call. But that was like on word of mouth with no organization, real quick, right? And so now we're at like really getting people out to get some work done, to do as we have been asked to do, which is to do something, to really engage not only our own communities and our own families, many of whom, as you heard, may be leaning in ways that we don't want them to be leaning, right? And so, I mean, the South Asian population, generally speaking, 70% in 2020 voted on the Democratic end of things, but that's not, that's something that certainly has been changing in different ways, and we have to be mindful of our own community and our own families. And so I think that's, but yeah, I mean, the money's been rolling in since then. We've seen it in many different ways. And I think I think part of what you're seeing is that, as we mentioned before, in Michigan, where the margin was 11,000 votes in 2016, you've got 130,000 South Asian voters. And in the five of the swing states, we have about 400,000 eligible South Asian voters, which is well past, times past the margin of victory. And so it's an important—
And do you know, Anurima, of those 400,000 in those swing states, what the percentages are, Dems versus Republicans?
I think it's probably trending 70% or so, Areva, to Dems. I can't quite say that's how it's playing out. We saw about 250,000 of the eligible voters actually vote, or maybe a little bit less than that. But I think the question is, like, how do we get the rest of those folks to be voting, and how do we actually engage them in a way that is going to center the kind of values that we know are really important in our country right now, which is to be able to invest in families and in our safety, in our education, and in our future, which is not what the Republican Party is putting out here.
All right, Tanbir, I may have given you the hardest question of the day, and that's about men, because we know Donald Trump says he has a lock on most men, and there's some polls out that shows that his numbers are definitely higher amongst men than they are women. And we know he's targeting certain groups of men, like Black men and Latino men. Where are Asian men, just overall in terms of their affinity for someone like Donald Trump? Do they see themselves as, this kind of, image of a tough guy? Donald Trump likes to appeal. He thinks he's appealing to men by talking, tough, by using profanity, by threatening to, use violence against people, by demeaning women. He does a lot of things that in popular culture may be considered, a tough guy, but a lot of it's just rude, obnoxious, childish petulant conduct. But what about Asian men, particularly Indian men?
Yeah, so definitely the hardest question I'm hearing tonight. So, like what I'm thinking, it's definitely unfortunate that best case scenario, just a rough estimate is that it's pretty even. And when I say it's even, I say that meaning that there seems to be like a half reaction that doesn't like how he is towards women. They don't like it because Kamala Harris is a very educated, very successful woman. And even Usha Vance is, like you said before, she's Yale educated. A lot of South Asian women politicians are. Pramila Jayapal, even Jenifer Rajkumar, she's Stanford Law graduated. So a lot of people who don't like her, even here, they respect her. She's running for New York City Comptroller now. They don't like a lot of people, but they're like, oh, she's Stanford Law educated. We like her. I hear the same with Kamala Harris, Usha Vance. A lot of Democrats are like, you know what, JD Vance, get him out of here. But his wife is intelligent. So the intelligence gets respected by some, and then by others, they're intimidated by it. You see it everywhere. A lot of people, the intelligence, the education intimidates them. They don't like when it's above. And with Donald Trump, like you said, his like bravado act, his bully act, that's what it is. We've seen it since 2015. It hasn't stopped. He's been running for president since I was a freshman in high school. I'm in my second year of grad school now. So, it's just going on. And it's the same script he's using over and over again. And it is just not stopping. But with South Asian men, with Indian men, it really is unfortunate that a lot of them do see elements of them or what they want to be. Whether it is that they can't really be it or they're not brave enough to be it, that I can't speak to. Who knows what's going on in their mind, those little cogs running through their head. But there's parts of Donald Trump that some people see that they want to be, and they're trying to live vicariously through that. So they're just going along for the ride. But a lot of other people, they are genuinely at the doors when we're talking to them. They're disgusted and they're appalled by him and the GOP entirely. Their attack on reproductive rights, the Supreme Court, they're not stopping. Donald Trump Republicans, they're saying that they're not wanting a national abortion ban. They'll leave it to the states. But that's their words. Their actions are pointing otherwise. And people know that. A lot of people know that. A lot of men, a lot of South Asian, a lot of Indian men know that. Because they're telling us when we're at the doors that they know this and they're not for it. So
Can I
Yeah,
jump in
sure,
for 1
jump
second?
in, Anurima. You know some Asian men.
yeah.
And let me just say a few things about South Asian men, Indian men in particular. I grew up in a household where my mom had started a domestic violence shelter for South Asian women, and so I've spent a lot of my time understanding the ways in which we see the misogyny, violence towards women, and a real questioning, right? So I totally appreciate Tanbir talking about the kind of respect that is accorded, but that respect also is one in which I hear all the time from what I call the uncles, my parents' generation, that they don't think Kamala's qualified to be president of the United States, right? That they worry about whether or not she should be in the role, and it's flabbergasting because you're like, how do we have a convicted felon who grew up with all kinds of gold coins in his mouth and hasn't and is really not done well in any way. I mean, this idea that he's a business, he's won in the business world is total BS, right? And we're sitting here watching someone who has built her way up and has done so in a way that accords a lot of integrity, and you're questioning those qualifications. And so I think we come from cultures that have a deep-seated misogyny, a deep-seated sense of questioning what women's roles are. And part of what we're all trying to do is to open up some space for something different. And there were, I want to be clear here. There have been South Asian men for Harris calls. There have been many Asian American of different backgrounds calls to support Kamala, and we see that out here as well. I saw it certainly at the Democratic National Convention, where I was there all week. But I do think this question of getting to work and being out here really representing for the vice president in her presidential campaign is something, unfortunately, I see women taking much more of a lead on.
Let me ask you this,
Right.
Anurima, based on what you just said about kind of the culture amongst Asian men, who are the trusted messengers that they will listen to? We know with respect to Black men, the Harris team has dispatched certain men. I won't call them leaders, because younger people don't tend to think of leaders in the way that I think, folks in our generation may have, where there was like this, really iconic leader that everyone would listen to. It seems to be now that there's lots of leaders leading different factions. But are there people in the Asian, particularly the Indian community, that have the kind of cachet, that have the kind of trust in the community that, say, some of these misogynistic men might listen to?
Yeah, I'll let Tanbir take this too, but I think that part of this comes from, we have a lot of South Asian men who have done very well in business. We have South Asian men who are leading in the private sector in different ways.
Mhm.
And I think those are the messengers that we need. I think the South Asian men who are elected to office around the country are not necessarily going to sway those folks who have these questions. And so I think we need to go from the inside for the people who they look to as their colleagues, and people who they see as the people to respect and who are winning in America, and have them lead this message. But I'll turn it to Tanbir.
Right. And earlier in the call, I also did mention, like, a lot of South Asian households, there's a conservative mold we grow up into, break up. So I really do appreciate Anurima bringing that up again. But as far as influencers, for lack of a better term, go, I mean, he's an elected official, but he's also successful in the business world too. Congressman Rohana, I know he's respected amongst conservatives too, because he does have that reach across the aisle appeal. But I do also agree with Anurima that it should really come from people from the community. That's really all that I see these conservative, or these really just head in the sand South Asian men who just really like living in their own bubble, because that's what they grew up in, right? They grew up in this for decades. They are like the uncle generation, so that's what I'll call them. They grew up in a different time than I. They grew up in a cultural bubble. They don't want to break that bubble just yet. Who knows when they'll want to? It's going to take someone in that bubble who has a broader mind to kind of get them to do so. I don't think it's going to be a politician, even though, again, like I said, Congressman Rohana, he's respected amongst conservatives, so they look to him. He's also like very business savvy. He's like he is tech. He's successful in the tech industry. So I think he's just like a little scrape off the ice block. But it has to come from someone within that bubble.
Right, that they respect as a business person. Well, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Anurima. Thank you so much, Tanbir.
Thank you.
Appreciate the work both of you are doing on the ground. Appreciate the voices that you're lifting up, obviously, in this campaign. And, even when we're not in a campaign year, getting folks involved in electoral politics is everyone's responsibility. We all have to reach one and teach one and bring one up with us. So again, thanks to both of you.